Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a fine edition, Tuesday edition of Ask That. And today we're going to get down and dirty with a topic that's near and dear to my heart. We're going to talk about communities and what that really means. And with me today, I have a good friend, Tony Gemoll. Tony, how are you, sir?
Doing good. We've had an interesting weather day, but other than that, doing good.
We have had an interesting weather day. And since you are from the Wisconsin area, why don't you explain who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am Tony Gemoll. I work as an enterprise architect at Northwestern Mutual. On the side passion of mine is building communities internally and externally to my company. With that, I run the Milwaukee JavaScript meetup, help out where I can with that conference, help out with other community activities where I can.
So this is going to be an interesting conversation between you and I because I know that this is, for those who are listening, we have had a conversation around this many, many times about many different things. You and I have gotten certainly super... we're both very passionate about this subject. And so this kind of came at a whim today of I ended up having an opening in the schedule and whatnot. So we're here, we're talking about communities. Before we get into that, I think let's start by defining what does the word community mean to you?
Sure. To me, it's a group of similarly minded individuals that kind of get together for a common interest. The community that I'm most interested in, for example, is like the technology developer community in the Milwaukee area and greater Wisconsin area.
Yeah. Keep going.
So with that, I feel like community is that thing that feeds off of itself. It can help make the area better. It can help transform the kind of environment that you work in. It helps transform kind of the environment that you live in. You can learn from it. You can gain knowledge from it. You can contribute back to it to help it grow. Like it's kind of this big melting pot of ideas to me.
Yeah, and I think the thing that you and I have learned as of recently is that the word community is a super overloaded term, which used a lot or thrown around a lot. We typically think we know what the other person's talking about when in reality, we really may not.
Yeah. So to kind of expand on that, we've seen it used in reference to certain aspects of a larger community. So like the startup community or the kind of a large corporate business community versus like the whole technologist community as a whole.
Sure. So fair to say that some communities may or may not have some corporate motive or motive behind them rather than the altruistic side of like, here's a group of individuals who came together to better one another.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I have selfish reasons too for like all of this community stuff is I realized a long time ago, like if there's an awesome group of people that I am around, it in turn makes me better. So like my selfishness is if that awesome group of people can get bigger, then I in turn get better.
Sure.
So
you are very selfish. I just want everybody to know that.
I don't hide that at all.
So we've got a definition around communities. I know you and I are both involved in a variety of them. And I know one of the things you wanted to talk about today was building communities. So let's start from the basis of what that is. I mean, in your mind, what does building a community look like?
It could take a lot of different forms. So for me, it's building kind of a community around, say, JavaScript with the meetup that I'm trying to do and trying to figure out ways to help grow that, help foster it, help get people excited about being a participant in that, either as a speaker or as a somebody who attends, and just seeing where we can take that and seeing kind of what is possible. But it seems like there's a lot of effort that goes into this where you can't really see what's happening, even if you do kind of try to capture analytics and metrics and stuff. So for us, for example, as we try different things, since our attendance fluctuates kind of greatly, we can't really put a pin on saying like, oh, that really worked or that didn't really work.
Sure. So all in all, we're talking about kind of winning over the hearts and minds of people to come together and do something. And in what we're talking about right now, we're talking about a user group, a developer conference, something that is self-organized, typically, I don't want to say low dollar, but they're not people's, there's no corporate motive behind like, let's put this group together and out the other end comes, I don't know, something.
Yep. And that's what we kind of like really seen is as we've found better speakers, and have raised attendance kind of on average overall, is kind of the quality of the conversation seems to be increasing as well. And also just the level of like how willingness people are to have those conversations at all levels of expertise is kind of amazing as it grows.
It's interesting that you kind of put that on speakers. I think speakers is certainly one pivot to the experience, but I would say the age of the community, the familiar big word. The fact that people continue to come time over time. Now they've seen the same faces. They feel a little bit more comfortable. They know where the door is. They know, how things run. And I would say that the leaders of the community, air quotes, leaders, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who has like a budgetary thing or whatnot, but drive just as much of the interaction paradigm and whatnot as anybody else does. So
it's an interesting conversation too, because we, with the meetup, had considered having kind of like a roadshow and kind of moving it all around and trying different places, and found out that may not be in our best interest because, a large chunk of us are introverts. So therefore having to find a new location and maybe ask for directions is not the most like thing to do in the world. So one of the things we strive to do is have a like consistent time and date and location.
Sure.
So if you've been to one, like how to get there, so it's no big deal.
Yep.
So even if the topic's kind of a different audience, showing up is like your only worry is if somebody there that I know or somebody there I can talk to type of worry.
Yeah. I mean, we're typically habitual creatures, so being able to budget and schedule for a thing, works out pretty well. I get that. So, I mean, I'll ask the hard question. So what?
Sure.
I mean, why do we need to do this anyways? Don't we have Google and everything else? So what? So what, Tony? So what about communities?
All right. So we're going to go to a personal story just because I think it fits here. Kind of many moons ago, let me start this way. I describe myself as a recovering shy person. And for those that don't know, like introversion and shyness are two very different things. Like shyness is crippling. So I would go to things like that conference or a meetup and want to like see conversations or hear conversations happening, but I could never like walk into them and introduce myself into them because that was always super hard.
Sure.
So the why to all of this is I realized one day, like, I want to be involved in those conversations because those conversations typically have way more depth and way more knowledge transfer than your like 40-minute talk. So
Okay.
one of the reasons that I still really enjoy doing the meetup and why I, for example, like that conference and the way that it's organized is there is time set away to make sure those conversations happen.
Yep.
And for me, those conversations are where I learn the most.
Okay.
They can happen in the kind of the digital space, but like all communication in person, in meet space, is the best way for that to happen.
Okay. Why? Okay, as the recovering shyness person, like
Yes.
this seems at odds with one's strategy to do that. So why do you feel like that was the best drug for your addiction? I don't know.
I just felt like I mean, to be honest, it was kind of like the whole fear of missing out
Okay.
thing is like I always felt like I was always missing out on what would make a code camp or a conference great because I wasn't in those conversations. And to be honest, like you look at Twitter and like your favorite conference hashtag or whatever, and to me, like the things that look exciting about an event seems to be more around like I ran into this person and I had a 20-minute conversation with this person on a subject. You'll see a lot of, this person's giving a talk and, they're saying really great words, but to me, it seems the higher positivity, the more excitement comes from the random encounters that seem to have happened at a given function.
Sure. Well, I mean, I certainly agree with that. It's certainly the way that I've thought about our community and modeled our stuff. I've had enough people tell me that, when we started, we were crazy and that virtual conferences were all the thing. And how dare us have 30 minutes between sessions? Nobody wants to talk to one another. Like, I've heard every story in every book as to why I shouldn't do what I'm doing. And none of them is the reality. It's not why we do it. We do it for the reason you just said.
So you get into the kind of the cliche reasons too of like growing your network is never a bad thing. I am employed at Northwestern Mutual because of a conversation I had at a meetup. I can point to like 10 other cases off the top of my head of connections that were made that eventually turned into jobs from, talking at a meetup or a conference. So there's other aspects to this, but the part for me, like I said, is, these deep technical conversations is where I tend to learn a lot.
Yeah, I literally at 1:30 told a group of 13 and 14-year-old girls that there are two things you need to get really good with. You need to it is what you know, and it is who you know, and you can like it or not, but growing your network and putting yourself out there to do that fixes the who you know, and you can always work on the what you know. Like that's a known quantity.
Yep.
So, all right. So community is important. We're passionate about it. That's great. Let's, how did you start to? You're worried about you had this fear that you were missing out, and so you took the step and you put yourself out there to at least get involved. So now how do you take the next step, which is actually getting involved in the conversation instead of being kind of passive to the background of things?
So the way that happened for me was kind of by accident. So I don't know that my particular advice or my particular story applies outside of me, but what happened is I made a decision that I wanted to get over this and I wanted to participate. And so I started showing up to some of the meetups in the Milwaukee area and kind of getting comfortable with that. The Milwaukee area had a IRC channel, which is now a Slack channel.
Yes, because that's where IRC goes.
Yeah. I mean, why not? And there was a conversation about topics for an upcoming meetup and trying to get something scheduled. And I made a suggestion and accidentally became an organizer of the Milwaukee JavaScript meetup because I asked that question. They're like, hey, cool, you can do this. And I was like, and it was too late.
Everybody stepped backwards and you were still standing there.
Yep. And then that kind of threw me head first into this kind of environment. I found out that I had a kind of a passion for trying to do this. And then as everyone kind of found new gigs and moved kind of out of Wisconsin, I was the last organizer for this particular meetup. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Sure.
My general advice is find the topic that you're passionate about and show up and kind of see what's out there. Milwaukee has some 90 plus meetups with probably like 30 of them that are active. So there's usually somebody talking about a topic that you're interested in and kind of just show up and see what happens.
Yep. So yeah, that is certainly a backwards way of getting involved.
Yes.
Yeah, that I don't know that it'd be my suggestion for everybody, but good on you, Tony. Nice job. Thank you. I mean, hindsight being 2020, like, what was the hard stuff? You know, I mean, what did you find? See, I'm kind of conflicted here, right? Because I think there's two sides of building the community. I think there's a piece of like you stepping out, just being involved, which builds the community. And then there are some freak shows like you and me who are like financially vetted into making sure, or have taken I'll say we've taken a financial risk to make sure that there is a safe place for communities to go. And the two things, I use those words kind of carefully because not everybody should go become an organizer. Not everybody should go become a speaker. Not everybody, and everybody should show up. And all three of those are important. All three of those things need to work harmoniously together.
Yeah.
And everybody needs to share, right? Like the JavaScript group needs to share with the other group, and the other group, and the other group, and the other state, and in the other country, because there's a lot to be learned from all of those places.
So, yes. As an organizer, the hardest thing we do is finding people who are willing to speak. Even harder than that, given Wisconsin's diversity makeup, finding non-white dudes to speak is extremely hard.
Yep.
Which is something we try to work on as much as possible. So from an organizer standpoint, like that's the hardest thing we do. The rest of it is pretty easy in comparison. From kind of the non-organizer point of view, it's kind of like find whatever you're comfortable in. I'm not saying everyone needs to speak. It is a good way to figure out if you know what you're talking about or not. It's a pretty easy check. And in that aspect, what we try to do is we're doing it actually twice this year, but normally we'll do it at least once a year. We'll do lightning talks at the Milwaukee JavaScript meetup. That basically is you get 15 minutes to talk about whatever you want, show off a thing. Like, I don't care if it's a library, something you built, like come and just talk about a thing for 15 minutes. And we're doing that as a way to allow new speakers to get their toes or their feet wet. Yep. Anyone can be asked about a topic for 15 minutes and it's not that hard. So the only thing you're really faced with is that whole you're talking in front of people problem. Like the content's pretty easy in comparison. And then if you like it, go on to doing more a longer frame talk or whatever, speak at conferences. As far as attendance, my biggest message is there's value there. It's that whole networking piece, as we talked before. The hardest part kind of about that is finding a place where you're comfortable.
Yep.
And one of the things that we tried to do early on is have one of those things that say how you should act on it.
What's it? I don't know. Card? Computer?
No, oh my gosh, the word just left my brain. Not a terms of service.
Code of conduct.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a code of conduct. We haven't had to enforce it, thankfully, but it's attached to like every message we put out that says, hey, we have this. It basically says like, we're here to practice, good conversation, empathy. Like We're not here to single out people or make them feel unwelcome. So that's what we try to do to make being in attendance easier.
Sure.
I mean, it's at the bare minimum, the least we can do, I think.
Yeah, from an organizer's perspective, certainly. But I will argue that I think the Midwest suffers from a show-up problem. Yeah. I think relative to a California or an Austin or I'm going to leave San Francisco alone, but other regions throughout the United States, I think we suffer from a show-up problem, and I say that because I don't know. There's something like 60,000 registered like software professionals, developers in the like Chicago, Milwaukee, Indiana. There's an onion, and there's some statistic somewhere, and it's tens of thousands. It was more than 50,000. And when you think of that conference or our meetups or the Chicago Code Camp or whatever, name whatever, the Milwaukee Code Camp, when only 1,000 people show up, like those are pathetic numbers when you're talking about tens of thousands who exist. And I get it. There's some distance problems. People outside of Chicago don't want to drive into Chicago, and Chicago don't want to drive outside of the city. So I understand that there's snow 6 months out of the year and suburbs, and like I get some of that, but there's a whole lot of stuff, and there's a whole lot of people not showing up.
Yep.
And I struggle with a whole lot of people who are trying to build communities, and then we have a whole lot of people who don't show up. And I don't understand.
It's
not that there's an answer. I just I know that it's valuable. You know that it's valuable. There's a whole lot of every time I speak at a user group or something, and these are already I typically, this isn't the right terminology, but they're already like the 1%ers, right? They've already come. They've already believe in it. They've already made that step. Whether or not they say anything or not, they've taken an hour or 2 hours of their time to somehow better themselves. And so now you have an engagement problem, right? We want people to talk and network and do those things, which is great. So us as organizers have this like dilemma of like, okay, I got to get Jimmy to talk to Jane and Jane to talk to Jim and whatever. But there's this whole other group of folks that we just can't get in or don't see value. And that pains me.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because, so take that conference, for example. It's going on for, what's this, 7th year?
Yes,
I always forget.
Yep.
All right, so this will be its 7th year. Like, I'm currently sitting in a 30-story building. I'm full of developers. I'm fairly sure I could go to any floor in this building and go and find multiple people that have never heard of it.
Absolutely.
And I'm not saying that's necessarily like the conference's fault.
No,
I'm
that's
saying
the reality.
Is like this goes into an issue we've talked about at length too, which is we don't necessarily talk about the fun stuff that we've done or are doing or brag about the experiences that we had.
Yep.
And go like, this thing was awesome. We need to do this thing. And it's weird to me because I can take that a step further and go, I work here and I run a meetup and fairly vocal about like, hey, we're doing this thing and post in our like internal chat things. And I'm still fairly confident I could go to any floor in this building and go, hey, have you heard about Milwaukee JS? And find like a majority of the people go, what's a meetup?
Right.
And I'm like, this is weird.
Yep. And, you know, and look, I completely understand that it's not a thing for everybody, and that's totally cool. Like that, and I think communities. We actually wrote about this on the Medium publication. Like communities happen in the workplace, outside of the workplace, within the family. Like there's a lot of like circles that you can draw where the community happens, and organized, not organized, whatever, online, not online. And I just still find it. I still find that we're, I don't want to say immature in our community around here, but it feels super immature in growing. But just the level of participation across the board, the level of camaraderie between some of the groups of all the things coming together seems. There's a lot of work to do, right?
Yep.
And it's not a bad thing, just a reality.
And I agree. Like, you know, not meeting in person isn't for everyone, and like people have kids and families, and like I get all that. The part where I want to get to is where you're able to make the choice on whether or not to participate because you have other things that are important to you. I want to get past where that choice is made for you because you don't know of the thing that's happening.
Right. Totally.
So like we, in Milwaukee, it feels like we have very segregated communities, in that like this group of people over here knows about, say, security, and this group of people over here know about developers, but this other group is also developers, and they don't cross. So will, like for me, for example, who I feel like I'm fairly connected, will hear about an event that happened a week ago and go, I had no idea. I like that never crossed any of the mediums that I watch.
Sure.
And it's kind of just frustrating of how do we solve kind of that bigger problem of just knowing, being visible.
Yeah.
Especially when it's like on a meetup scale where we don't have marketing dollars.
Yeah. Well, let's switch the topic, not topic, but let's switch the line of thinking at the moment. What makes a good community?
For me, one that's kind of empathetic and willing to kind of go down the rabbit holes that show up, willing to have kind of the harder conversations while also listening to kind of all viewpoints without being kind of judgmental. Because I feel like that's when a lot of the learning can happen. A lot of the fun conversations can happen.
Sure.
More than like getting a little bit more broad than that would be, you know, one that supports kind of itself and says, hey, like Sally over here is doing this awesome thing, and so is Bob, and, you know, congratulates them and doesn't necessarily tear them down or anything. Basically, it helps each other grow.
I could dig on that. I mean, that's been our entire MO for a long time. I think it's interesting. I'm going to guess if I asked you what makes a bad community, you would probably say the negativity that surrounds some of what we do.
Yeah. And that's, yeah. So kind of and we're still kind of dealing with that too in kind of the Milwaukee area. We've had spats on kind of various social medias that have been kind of detrimental to those various platforms which have sucked.
Yeah.
And we're only now starting to get over them.
Yeah, I mean, I not that I've worked in a lot of other industries, but I think we have in the software industry, we certainly have a bit of negativity that seems to surround a development team or whatnot. There's tension between, Scrum Masters and product owners versus developers or engineers and the testing team, and like the a cohesive like development team doesn't necessarily universally exist across things. And then we have this hierarchical set of developers who are like, yeah, that's the wrong way. And it's like, it shipped. Like, is it? It's making money. Is that wrong? Right?
So there's kind of two thoughts that I have on this. The first one is a kind of a story about my naiveness. I'm not the most cultured person in the world, growing up in, the Midwest, in a town that's like 20 miles outside of Milwaukee. But we heard of like the GitHub issues from years ago and a lot of the sexism and racism in tech in the Valley. And it's like, oh, that doesn't happen here. Why would that happen here? I've never seen that happen. And then kind of come to find out once I finally started getting into the community more and having some of the harder conversations, you're like getting told this happens all the time. It's like, that sucks.
Yeah.
And kind of going on that, one of the kind of the important parts of that I see in community is if the only community is the one that is at your company, like it gets really difficult to know that there's other ways or other viewpoints out there.
Yep.
With participating in the community, you can start seeing other viewpoints and then get support from other people where we as a bigger community can start being more mature and standing up for ourselves.
Yep.
Like you brought up, well, if it's shipped and it's making money, what's the kind of the big deal if people are kind of using it? One of the things that came out is the Stack Overflow developer survey came out today. Yeah. And there was a question about ethics on there. And there's some debate on the context of what is unethical versus ethical. But the question was, would you be willing to do something unethical in your job? And it was like 42% said no, like 8% said yes, and the rest were, it depends. And I was like, what do you mean it depends? Like,
depends what
seems
the
like
lawyer
that'd be,
said.
yeah.
I think it was that same set of posts when I saw yours this morning, where you were talking about the ratio of men to women,
yes.
and while bad, it's the reality, and it could certainly be better. Some of my best mentors and people that I've worked with have been women, and I enjoy working with women. But the reality is every industry suffers from something similar, right? There's not enough men in nursing. There's not enough women in, like my aunt was a mechanic in the 70s. You don't know how many women were mechanics in the 70s? None, right? And so, like, we sometimes I think we have this like unfair view of how it should be in tech, and we're somehow better than every other industry, when the reality is our industry is super in its infancy compared to like building buildings and laying roads and plumbing. Like all the trade stuff is far over, and there's a whole lot of stuff that we could learn from them, and they're jacked up too. Like none of this is right. So universally we have like a bigger problem.
Yes.
Which to be acknowledged, right? I think it's good that this community, it's becoming more and more of a conversation, right? Because that's, to your point, that's where this kind of stuff starts, and it just takes an active role to change it.
Yep.
And that is work, and people have to sign up for it and not just throw Twitter shit around and expect things to change. Now, I'm not talking about yours. I just mean in general.
No,
right?
I know. Yep.
Like if you want to get women involved in tech, what are you doing to go get women involved in tech? That's the reality of it.
Or to take that to the next logical step, if you don't want to be regulated by the government for doing silly things, like regulate yourself.
Right.
Which there's Uncle Bob Martin has a awesome talk on that very subject.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time until we're regulated like everyone else.
Yep. Yeah.
And if you don't want it broken, we should probably do it ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's kind of end with talking about how people can seize community. I mean, we can sit here and I think the reality is anybody who wants to, I don't know, for me, community is about do. It is not about, it's not about talk. These are people who show up. They walked in on their feet to go do something. They showed up. They have a conversation. Community is just about, for me, is always about the do side of things versus the sit at home. And not that you can't do at home. That sounds bad, but I don't know. There's probably going to be a comment about that one, but I guess I'd like to see people take a more active role in being involved, whether that's encouragement or mentoring or reviewing or writing or whatever. I don't know. Like there's nothing stopping anybody. There's no reason you can't go to a meetup. There's no reason you can't write a blog. There's no reason you can't go leave a good comment. There's no reason you can't. Everybody's got something of value to offer. So go get involved with your local community and help make that community better.
I think that's a good kind of viewpoint. Like, I'm not saying you have to come to my meetup. I mean, I would love it, but I'm not saying you have to. Like, there's a million things you could be doing. Like, just show up. That was actually a podcast quote that I heard the other day. There's a lot of cliches that are all about, or a lot of quotes that are all about very similar, but the one that got me that I heard earlier this week was, the people that usually win are the people that show up. Like, showing up is step one. And if you want to make a difference, that's the first thing you have to do.
Yep.
The rest will come after that.
Yep. Yeah, I certainly agree. It's not hard. What about? I mean, what about the fear of? I don't want to say discrimination, but the fear of putting yourself out there in the community and then being rejected. I mean, is that FUD? Is that reality? Do we have to have thick skin to interact with one another? Like, are we as humans just equally evil, or are there really good people?
So for me, that's a common fear that I have with like new speakers coming on and doing a thing. And so like, what about that guy that's good, or gal? It doesn't have to be a guy, but what about that person in the audience that like make me look foolish? I've seen hundreds of talks now. I've seen the like random person that wants to ask their one very specific question and derail your talk. I've never seen somebody like stand up and go, "You're wrong and you're dumb. Please stop." It's always been, very professional, very kind of there.
Sure, but that's from a speaker perspective, right? Like that can alienate the person that's sitting next to that person who asked that. I want to derail your thing, such that now that other person is afraid to ask a question.
So I was using that to say, for the most part, I think the general population, especially in the communities in the development world that I have lived in, are understanding, professional. Like, they're not looking to make you feel bad or kind of make whatever the words that you used were.
Yeah.
Like, for the most part, we have all good intentions. There's exceptions to every rule, and I understand that I'm talking as a white guy, and that makes an incredible difference. But from what we've seen with the Milwaukee JS meetup, there are fewer and fewer cases of bad stuff happening. So I would love to sit here and say it's perfect. I can't.
No, I mean,
I would love the help to make it better.
Yeah, the world's not perfect, right? You're going to say bad stuff, and to one person that's going to mean, on a scale from a level to 1 to 10 is going to be super terrible, and another person that's going to mean a level 5, which is, I don't know, bad or not bad, I don't know. But
so I guess my advice in that category is just find out who your allies are and make sure they're there and to support you. If anybody has a problem in any of the communities that I run in, I'm willing to help out and make sure that gets resolved, or people feel safe in the activities that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a pretty good piece of advice. I mean, I think there's no reason that you couldn't reach out to a me or a you, regardless of even if we were involved with that thing, and say, hey, I had this thing happen. Can you help, or do you have some advice or whatnot? I'd certainly take the mic to go forward and say, I don't know, try to go fix it. And not sometimes we don't know what we don't know, which to your point earlier, talking and sharing helps that as well. Yep. All right, I know you've got a hard stop. So before we get there, and before I let you go back to your big enterprise architecture job where you put down all these rules and destroy community, because that's what you enterprise architects do.
Trying desperately hard not to do that, but okay.
That's why I actually threw out the comment about if my code is making money, is it really a bad thing? Because I knew that would get under your architect's skin.
Yes, it is a bad thing.
Yeah, whatever.
It's going to cost me money later.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
Not. It's paying your salary, Mr. Overhead. No, hurts. I do. I'm just kidding. No. I know it gets under your skin. At the end of each one of these, though, I do take a moment and extend a piece of gratitude. And I, on behalf of myself and Carrie and everybody at that conference and the community that surrounds you, want to just say thank you, because I know you have poured your time. You've also not poured your time not just into running the user group, but to being actively involved in everything from a day-to-day perspective and putting yourself out there very genuinely. I know that it was hard for you to start speaking in the beginning, and I forced you to do it. I say force, but kind of didn't give you an option to say no. And you entrusted in us to do that. And so I just want to say thank you for doing that and being part of it. It means a lot.
Same goes back to you. A lot of this was because of that conference. So I appreciate it for at least kicking me in the butt.
And to that, right? This conversation was about community. And I know we've had this conversation privately a number of times about how do we make the broader communities together, and how do we work with corporations better, such that there's this right level of involvement from the corporations to the startup to the this to the that. And I know that it's not an easy thing to do. I know everybody thinks that it's it just works, and the reality is that it doesn't just work, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. I guess as somebody who runs, my last question for you before you go, somebody who runs a user group, a meetup, whatnot, what would be what's your piece of advice? What's your ask, your call to action to everybody who's watching, listening around community?
I think my biggest ask is essentially what I just said, find what you're into and show up, whether it's having conversations at a meetup, helping out at a school and teaching STEM related topics, or doing FIRST robotics, whatever you're into, find that thing and show up and do that.
And go share it.
Yes. And then the second part would be, please tell me about it. Like, if you enjoyed a meetup, if you enjoyed a conference, and this is going to sound selfish, if it's something that I've done, so I know like you really enjoyed it, because that's one of the biggest motivators for me, is knowing that the thing I'm doing is useful.
Yep. I'd agree.
The first one I would appreciate more. The second one is just to keep me motivated.
Yeah. I'll echo that. It's nice to know that you're doing a good job. It's nice to know that people are appreciative of the thing, because certainly everybody tells you when the bacon's raw. So,
yeah. And if it's not me who you appreciate, find that person and make sure they know.
Yeah.
To make that clear.
I agree. Tony, how do people get in touch with you? Where can they find you?
I'm at Ubert at most places, OOBERT, mainly on Twitter and GitHub. I hang out a lot in the Milwaukee Slack and chat in there a lot. I'm at that conference. I will be there this year. That's mainly it.
All right.
Or
meetup. That's right. Or it's your meetup. With that wraps another edition of Ask That. I and Tony are very curious your thoughts. So for anybody who's listening, make sure to ask some questions below. I'd love to hear your or read your opinions on what makes growing a community good. How do you get involved? What tips, tricks, hacks, whatever works. So put those in the comments below and be sure to watch them. With that being said, why don't you tell people about Ask That? Help us out. Give us a thumbs up, a likes. Tony, thank you for coming. And
thanks for having me.
Look forward to extending this conversation here soon. And making some more community awesome.
Sounds great.
All right, why don't you go do some architecture work?
Sounds good.
Draw a UML diagram or something.
Oh, that hurts, man.